My wife tells me every day that she wishes she were in the grave with the children, and I really cannot blame her. In January 1863, as a result of pressing money problems and Jenny's reaction to them, there occurred the only serious quarrel between Marx and Engels. On January 6, Mary Burns died. She had been living with Engels for nearly 20 years and he regarded her as his wife. On hearing of her death, Marx wrote simply that the news of Mary's death both surprised and shocked me very much. She was very good-natured, witty and devoted to you, and then continued immediately to give Engels a lengthy description of his financial troubles. Engels replied after a few days, "You will find it natural that my own trouble and your frosty reception of it made it positively impossible for me to answer you earlier. All my friends, including Philistine acquaintances, have shown me on this occasion, which was bound to touch me very nearly, more sympathy and friendship than I could expect. You found the moments suitable to enforce the superiority of your cold thought processes." Marx waited 10 days before replying. "I thought it good to let some time pass before I answered you. Your situation on the one hand and mine on the other made it difficult to take a cool look at the situation. It was very wrong of me to write you the letter, and I regretted it as soon as it was posted. But it did not happen out of heartlessness. My wife and children will bear me witness that when your letter came, it was early in the morning. I was as much shattered as by the death of one of those nearest to me. But when I wrote to you in the evening, it was under the impression of very desperate conditions. I had the landlord's broker in the house, the butcher protesting at my check, shortage of coals and food, and little Jenny in bed. In such circumstances, I can generally save myself only by cynicism." This in turn led to a quarrel between Marx and Jenny. Marx had written in the same letter of excuse to Engels that what made me particularly wild was the fact that my wife believed that I had not sufficiently accurately communicated the true state of affairs to you. Marx considered that Jenny had forced him into a false position with regard to Engels. "I can now tell you without further ceremony," he wrote to Engels, "that, in spite of all the pressure I have endured during the last weeks, nothing burdened me, even relatively speaking, as much as this fear that our friendship should now break up. I repeatedly told my wife that nothing in the whole mess was important to me compared with the fact that, owing to our lousy bourgeois situation and her eccentric excitement, I was not in a position to comfort you at such a time, but only to burden you with my private needs. Consequently, domestic peace was much disturbed and the poor woman had to face the music, although it was no fault of hers inasmuch as women are accustomed to demand the impossible. Naturally, she had no idea of what I wrote, but her own reflection could have told her what the outcome would be. Women are funny creatures, even those endowed with much intelligence." The children were also a cause of much concern to Marx and Jenny. In 1860, the year of Jenny's smallpox, the three girls were aged 16, 15, and 4 years old. Jenny found their poverty all the harder to bear as the sweet girls, now blooming so lovelily, have to suffer it as well. At the beginning of 1863, Jenny gave the following description of her daughters to one of her friends. "Even if the word beautiful is not fitting for them, I must still say, even at the risk of being laughed at for my maternal pride, that all three of them look very neat and interesting. Jennychen is strikingly dark in hair, eyes and complexion and, with her childishly rosy cheeks and deep, sweet eyes, has a very attractive appearance. Laura, who is in everything a few degrees lighter and clearer, is in fact prettier than the eldest sister, as her features are more regular and her green eyes under her dark brows and long lashes shine with a continual fire of joy. We have made every effort we could towards their education. Unfortunately, we could not do so much for them in music as we would have hoped, and their musical accomplishments are not distinguished, although they both have particularly pleasant voices and sing with a very pretty expressiveness. But Jenny's real strong point is elocution, and because the child has a very beautiful voice, low and sweet, and from childhood had studied Shakespeare with fanaticism, she would in fact long ago have been on the stage had not regard for the family etc. held her back. Neither would we have placed any obstacle in her way if her health were sounder. The third one, the baby, is a true bundle of sweetness, charm and childish frenzy. She is the light and life of the house. All three children are attached body and soul to London and have become fully English in customs, manners, tastes, needs and habits, and nothing frightens them more than the thought of having to exchange England for Germany. And I myself would find the prospect frightening. Above all, London is so colossal that one can disappear into nothing. But things were not always so sunny. Marx had to ask Engels urgently to spend some days with them, as it is absolutely necessary that my daughters see a man again in the house. The poor children have been shaken too early by the bourgeois shit. Jenny's health was particularly bad as she suffered continually from chest ailments. This, too, Marx considered was attributable to their poverty. Jenny is now old enough to feel the whole pressure and hastiness of our situation, and that, I think, is one of the principal causes of her ill health. Capital. In the summer of 1861, with the Void affair at last behind him, Marx began to work in earnest on the third chapter on Capital in general. For a year progress was very slow, though Marx considered that he had managed to popularize his style. By April 1862 he felt in a position to tell Lassalle that his book would not be ready for 2 months, and added revealingly, "I have the peculiar characteristic that when I see something that I have written out 4 weeks later, I find it unsatisfactory and rework the whole thing." In any case, the work doesn't lose anything thereby. 2 months later he was working like the devil, not on the third chapter, but on the history of economic theory and particularly theories of surplus value that he wished to add to the chapter on capital, just as he had added a historical account of theories of money and circulation to the critique of political economy. He was padding his work out as the German wretches measure the value of a book by its cubic content. It was Marx's usual practice when domestic worries disturbed his concentration, and 1862 and 1863 were among the most troubled years of Marx's life, to turn to the historical part of his work. By the end of the summer he was getting depressed and expressed the wish to Engels to engage in some line of business. "Gray, dear friend, is all theory and only business is green. Unfortunately, I have come too late to this insight." He reread Engels' Condition of the Working Classes in England and was filled with nostalgia for the past. How freshly, passionately, and boldly is the matter dealt with here, without learned and scientific considerations. And even the illusion that tomorrow or the day after history will bring to light the result gives the whole a warmth and lively humor, compared with which the later Gray and Gray is damned unpleasant. A few years later he told one of his daughters that he felt himself to be a machine condemned to devour books and then throw them, in a changed form, on the dunghill of history. By the end of 1862 he told Kugelmann that the second part is now at last finished, though with the inevitable qualification that this was apart from the copying out and final polishing for the printer. It would contain, he continued, only what was intended as the third chapter of the first part, i.e. capital in general. It is, together with the first bit, the quintessence, and the development of what follows would be easy to complete, even by others, on the basis of what exists, with the exception perhaps of the relationship of different forms of the state to the different economic structures of society. But illness prevented any creative work for 3 months during the spring of 1863, and Marx concentrated on trying to give the historical part its final shape. He was, however, still confident that he could copy out the remainder very quickly. The possibility of competition from Lassalle spurred him on, and by the summer he was regularly working 10 hours a day and doing differential calculus in his spare time. In mid-August he reported to Engels that he was working on the manuscript for the printers, which would be 100% easier to understand than the critique of political economy. He added that the ease with which Lassalle produced his works on economics made him laugh. "When I look at my colossal work and see how I have had to shift everything round and even construct the historical part from material that was in part totally unknown." A certain number of the manuscripts from this period have either been lost or are inaccessible, so it is not possible to determine exactly how far Marx had got with his second part. The main manuscript to have survived from what Marx in 1837 to 58 conceived of as simply a third chapter would amount to about 3,000 printed pages, and comprises the historical stuff that Marx in the summer of 1863 seems to have decided to incorporate into volume 1, as the Germans only have faith in fat books. Some of this contained material later incorporated into the 3 volumes of Capital, but the major part was the historical section later published by Kautsky as the 4th volume of Capital under the title Theories of Surplus Value. The Theories of Surplus Value comprises 3 large printed volumes, of which a large part is simply extracts from previous theorists. Marx began with Stuart and the economists of the mercantile system, who tried to explain the origin of surplus value simply from circulation. He then went on to the physiocrats, who concentrated rightly, in Marx's view, on the sphere of production, albeit mainly agricultural production. Most of the first volume was taken up with extracts from Adam Smith and an attempt to separate scientific from ideological elements in his theories, particularly focusing on his distinction between productive and unproductive labor. The second volume dealt mainly with Ricardo, who was blamed for reliance on certain faulty premises taken over from Adam Smith. The discussion centered mainly around Ricardo's theories of profit and rent, and particularly his confusion of surplus value with profit. The third volume dealt with the Ricardian school and particularly the English socialists, whom Marx called the proletarian opposition based on Ricardo. He also attacked Malthus as a shameless sycophant of the ruling classes for advocating extravagant expenditure by them as a remedy for overproduction. Marx regarded Ricardo as the high point of bourgeois economic theory. Thereafter, as the class struggle sharpened, in place of disinterested inquirers, there were hired prize-fighters, in place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and evil intent of apologetic. Those who tried to harmonize the principles of capitalism with the interests of the proletariat merely produced a shallow syncretism of which John Stuart Mill is the best representative. The English socialists, Ravenstone, Hodgkin and others, at least had the merit of drawing from Ricardo's labor theory of value the correct notion of capitalist exploitation. But they lacked the requisite theoretical insights to accomplish the necessary total reconstruction of his system. The theories of surplus value show how firmly Marx's ideas are situated in the tradition of classical economics. As in other fields, Marx evolved his own ideas by a critique and elaboration of his predecessors. The volumes also contain a number of digressions, such as one on alienation and another on the growth of the middle class, where he reproaches Ricardo with forgetting to emphasize the constantly growing number of the middle classes, those who stand between the workman on the one hand and the capitalist and landlord on the other. From the summer of 1863 to the summer of 1865, there is a virtually complete silence in Marx's correspondence concerning his economic work. According to Engels, he spent 1864 and 1865 in drafting out Volume 3 of Capital. At the beginning of 1864 the finances improved, but another obstacle immediately arose: carbuncles. When Marx began sending off the final manuscript of Capital to the publisher, he wrote to Engels, "It is now 3 years since the first carbuncle was operated on. Since that time the thing has only let up in short intervals, and, of all types of work, the purely theoretical is the most unsuitable when you have this devilish mess in your body." The boils started very suddenly in the autumn of 1863 and almost proved fatal. On November 10, wrote Jenny, a terrible abscess was opened and he was in danger for a fairly long time afterwards. The disease lasted a good 4 weeks and caused severe physical sufferings. These were accompanied by rankling moral tortures of all kinds. Jenny was ushered from the room for the operation, during which Lenchen held Marx down, and the doctor, Allen, wondered at the stoicism of German philosophers. The boils, however, continually reappeared. They usually started in the autumn and came to full bloom, so to speak, in January. There were times when Marx's body was so covered with them that he could only stand upright or lie on his side on the sofa. He took lots of advice, seldom followed it very long, and after some years claimed to know more about boils than any doctor. Certainly he pursued widespread researches in the British Museum on the subject. At various times he took such extraordinary medicines as creosote, opium and arsenic, this for years on end, gave up smoking for months and took daily cold baths. He wished that the boils had been given to a good Christian who would have been able to turn his suffering to some account, but at the same time he comforted himself with the idea that the bourgeoisie would have good cause to remember his sufferings from this truly proletarian disease. On extreme occasions he would even operate on himself. Today, he wrote to Engels, "I took a sharp razor, a relic of dear lupus, and cut the wretch in my own person. He was proud to think that I am one of the best subjects to be operated upon. I always recognize what is necessary." When the boils approached his penis he lightened the occasion by copying out and sending to Engels specimens of 16th century French pornographic verse, a field in which he considered himself well read. He found his only relief in occasional visits to the seaside. In March 1866, for instance, he spent 4 weeks convalescing in Margate, where he was glad to find so little company that he felt he could sing with the miller of the D, "I care for nobody and nobody cares for me." One day he walked the 17 miles to Canterbury, an old, ugly medieval sort of town, not mended by large modern English barracks at the one end and a dismal dry railway station at the other end of the oldish thing. There is no trace of poetry about it. Happily I was too tired, and it was too late, to look out for the celebrated cathedral. In March 1865 Marx had signed a contract with the Hamburg publishers Meissner and Barré. Meissner's was a medium-sized publishing house, one of the few in Germany with democratic leanings,
dealing mainly in school textbooks and works on history and medicine.
This contract, which had been negotiated through Wilhelm Strohn, a former member of the Communist League who often visited Hamburg on business from England, gave May 1865 as the limit for the delivery of the manuscript, though this had to be amended in a later version. The terms of the agreement were not particularly advantageous to Marx, and he remarked to his future son-in-law Lafargue that capital will not even pay Lore the cigars I smoked writing it. By July 1865, in spite of illness and work for the incipient International, Marx was able to write to Engels that there are still 3 chapters to write to complete the theoretical part, RHE first 3 books. Then there is still the 4th book to write, the historical literary one. This is relatively the easiest for me, as all the problems are solved in the first 3 books, and thus this last one is more of a repetition in historical form. But I cannot make up my mind to send anything off until I have the whole thing in front of me. Whatever shortcomings they may have, my writings do have this advantage that they are an artistic whole, and that is only attainable through my habit of not letting them be printed until they lie before me complete. Marx was in a particular hurry to finish his The Thing Weighs on Me Like a Mountain. Also his friends Liebknecht, for example, were spreading over simplified versions of his ideas, and, as ever, Marx was haunted by the idea of not being able to complete his work before a revolutionary outbreak. In February 1866, being seriously ill and under pressure from Engels, Marx at last agreed to complete Volume 1 before drafting out the others. If I had enough money, that is more-0, for my family, and if my book were ready, it would be a matter of complete indifference to me whether I was thrown on the scrap heap today or tomorrow. And he continued with the following report on his progress: as far as this damned book goes, this is the situation. It was ready at the end of December. The discussion of ground rent alone is, in its present form, almost book length. I went to the museum in the day and wrote at night. I had to work through the new agricultural chemistry in Germany, especially Liebig and Schonbein, who are more important for this thing than all the economists put together, and also the enormous material that the French have given us since I was last occupied with this point. Although ready, the manuscript is gigantic in its present form, and no one else apart from me can edit it, not even you. I began the copying out and stylizing on the 1st of January, and the thing went on very briskly, since I was naturally delighted to lick the child smooth after so many birth pangs. But then once again the carbuncle broke it off. By November 1866 he was able to send off the first batch of manuscript, and the following April the whole was at last completed. Marx insisted on going to Germany himself with the manuscript, and tactfully informed Engels of his clothes and watch that needed to be redeemed from the pawnshop before his trip. Engels sent by return the halves of 7 5-pound notes. The other halves, as was their usual practice, followed when Marx telegraphed the safe arrival of the first batch. Marx sailed for Hamburg in mid-April, proved to be one of the few passengers who kept upright in the storm, and deposited his manuscript in Meissner's safe. Since there was a possibility of printing the manuscript immediately, the printing was eventually done by Wigand, who had published so much young Hegelian material in the 1840s. Marx decided to stay on in Germany and went to Hanover at the invitation of Dr. Kugelmann, a former member of the Communist League and now a much respected gynecologist, with whom Marx had been in correspondence since 1862. Marx described him as a fanatical adherent of our doctrine and our two persons. He bores me sometimes with his enthusiasm, which is the opposite of his cold style in medical matters. But he understands, and he is upright, reckless, unselfish, and what is most important, convinced. While in Hanover, Marx was amused to be invited by a messenger from Bismarck to put his great talents to the service of the German people. 2 years previously Marx had received a similar invitation, transmitted via Lothar Bücher, to write financial articles for the Prussian government's official journal. Marx subsequently published his correspondence with Bücher, to Bismarck's embarrassment, at the height of the anti-socialist agitation in 1878. The visit to Germany had a strange sequel, which is worth telling. In Marx's own words, the crossing from Hamburg to London was in general fair. Some hours before London, a German girl, whom I had already noticed for her military stance, explained to me that she wanted to go on the same evening to Weston-super-Mare and did not know how to deal with her large amount of luggage. The situation was all the worse since on the Sabbath helpful hands are few in England. I got the girl to show me the railway station that she had to go to in London. Her friends had written it on a card. It was the Northwestern, which I too would have to pass by.
So, as a good night, I offered to drop the girl off there. Accepted. On thinking it over, however, it occurred to me that Weston-super-Mare was southwest of London, whereas the station that I would pass by and that the girl had written on her card was northwest. I consulted the sea captain. Correct. The upshot was that she was to be set down in quite the other end of London from myself. Yet I had committed myself and had to put a good face on it. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon we arrived. I brought La Donna Errante to her station, where I learnt that her train left only at 8 in the evening. So I was in for it and had to kill 6 hours with Mademoiselle walking in Hyde Park, sitting in ice cream shops, and so on. It came out that she was called Elizabeth von Puttkamer, Bismarck's niece, with whom she had just spent some weeks in Berlin. She had the whole army list with her. She was a spirited, cultured girl, but aristocratic and black and white to the tip of her nose. She was not a little astonished to learn that she had fallen into red hands. I comforted her, however, with the assurance that our rendezvous would pass off without loss of blood, and saw her off safe and sound to the place of her destination. You can imagine what an uproar this would cause with blind or other vulgar Democrats, my conspiracy with Bismarck. Whether the meeting was really pure chance or a plant is impossible to say. The printing went slowly, and, although Marx was able to correct the first proof sheet on May 5, his 49th birthday, he had to return to London in mid-May. It was a return that he feared. The debts there are important and the Manichees are waiting insistently for my return. Then there is the family moaning, the inner collisions, the rush, instead of being able to approach my work fresh and untroubled. Throughout the summer Marx continued to be worried by his creditors and only had time to correct the proof sheet sent to him by Meissner. He forwarded them regularly to Engels for his opinion. It is interesting to note that Marx had not shown any of his drafts to Engels before they were sent to press. Engels considered that some of the more abstract first part bore the trace of the carbuncle. He also wished that Marx had introduced many more subtitles and had had his excursuses printed in a different type. Although the sharpness of the dialectical development was improved in Capital, Engels found the critique of political economy easier to grasp. Marx's letter to Engels on completing Capital, Volume 1. The text reads, August 16, 1867, 2 o'clock in the night. Dear Fred, I have just finished correcting the last galley proof, 49th, of the book. The appendix, on the form of value, is in small print and takes up I/4 galleys. I.e. preface likewise was corrected and sent back yesterday. So this volume is finished. It is you alone that I have to thank for this being possible. Without your self-sacrifice for me, I could never possibly have accomplished the enormous labor for the 3 volumes. I embrace you, full of thanks. Enclosed are 2 corrected galley proofs. I got the £15. Many thanks, readings, my dear, beloved friend. Yours, Karl. Marx. His opinion must have improved, for Marx wrote soon after that your satisfaction up till now is more important to me than anything that the rest of the world may say of it. By the end of August the last galley was sent off and Marx wrote jubilantly to Engels, to you alone I owe it that this was possible. Without your sacrifice for me I could not have got through the enormous labors of the 3 volumes. I embrace you, full of thanks. In the 3rd week of September 1867 Capital, Critique of Political Economy, Volume 1, Book 1, the production process of Capital appeared in an edition of 1,000 copies. Volume 1 of Capital is by no means the indigestible and virtually unreadable book that it has the reputation of being. It consists of 2 very distinct parts. The first 9 chapters are, indeed, of an extremely abstract theoretical nature, whereas the reset of the book contains a description of the historical genesis of capitalism which is at times extremely vivid and readable. The first 9 chapters contain what Marx called in his 1857 introduction the general abstract definitions which are more or less applicable to all forms of society. It is not only this abstract method that makes these chapters difficult, there is also the Hegelian cast of the book. In his afterword to the second German edition of the book, Marx explained that he was employing the Hegelian dialectic of which he had discovered the rational kernel inside the mystical shell by turning it right side up again. He even, as he said in the same afterword, went as far as coquetting with modes of expression peculiar to Hegel. A third factor which makes the beginning of Capital difficult is the fact that the concepts used by Marx are ones quite familiar to economists in the mid-19th century but thereafter abandoned by the orthodox schools of economics.
Since the third quarter of the 19th century, economists in Western Europe and America have tended to look at the capitalist system as given, construct models of it, assuming private property, profit, and a more or less free market, and to discuss the functionings of this model, concentrating particularly on prices. This marginalist school of economics has no concept of value apart from price. To Marx, this procedure seemed superficial for two reasons. Firstly, he considered it superficial in a literal sense, in that it was only a description of phenomena lying on the surface of capitalist society without an analysis of the mode of production that gave rise to these phenomena. Secondly, this approach took the capitalist system for granted, whereas Marx wished to analyze the birth, life, and death of a given social organism and its replacement by another, superior order. In order to achieve these two aims, Marx took over the concepts of the classical economists that were still the generally accepted tool of economic analysis, and used them to draw very different conclusions. Ricardo had made a distinction between use value and exchange value. The exchange value of an object was something separate from its price and consisted of the amount of labor embodied in the objects of production, though Ricardo thought that the price in fact tended to approximate to the exchange value. Thus, in contradistinction to later analyses, the value of an object was determined by the circumstances of production rather than those of demand. Marx took over these concepts, but, in his attempt to show that capitalism was not static but a historically relative system of class exploitation, supplemented Ricardo's views by introducing the idea of surplus value. Surplus value was defined as the difference between the value of the products of labor and the cost of producing that labor power, i.e. the laborer's subsistence, for the exchange value of labor power was equal to the amount of labor necessary to reproduce that labor power, and this was normally much lower than the exchange value of the products of that labor power. The theoretical part of Volume 1 divides very easily into three sections. The first section is a rewriting of the Critique of Political Economy of 1859 and analyses commodities, in the sense of external objects that satisfy human needs, and their value. Marx established two sorts of value: use value, or the utility of something, and exchange value, which was determined by the amount of labor incorporated in the object. Labor was also of a twofold nature according to whether it created use values or exchange values. Since the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, and the only thing they shared was labor, then labor must be the source of value. But since evidently some people worked faster or more skillfully than others, this labor must be a sort of average socially necessary labor time. There followed a difficult section on the form of value, and the first chapter ended with an account of commodities as exchange values, which he described as the fetishism of commodities in a passage that recalls the account of alienation in the Paris manuscripts and, even more, the note on James Mill. In order, said Marx here, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life, and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. The section ended with a chapter on exchange and an account of money as the means for the circulation of commodities, the material expression for their values, and the universal measure of value. The second section is a small one on the transformation of money into capital. Before the capitalist era, people had sold commodities for money in order to buy more commodities. In the capitalist era, instead of selling to buy, people had bought to sell dearer. They had bought commodities with their money in order, by means of those commodities, to increase their money. In the third section, Marx introduced his key notion of surplus value, the idea that Engels characterized as Marx's principal discovery in economics. Marx made a distinction between constant capital, which was that part of capital which is represented by the means of production, by the raw material, auxiliary material, and instruments of labor, and does not, in the process of production, undergo any quantitative alteration of value, and variable capital. Of this Marx said, that part of capital, represented by labor power, does, in the process of production, undergo an alteration of value. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value, and also produces an excess, a surplus value, which may itself vary, may be more or less according to the circumstances. This variation was the rate of surplus value around which the struggle between workers and capitalists centered.
The essential point was that the capitalist got the worker to work longer than was merely sufficient to embody in his product the value of his labor power. If the labor power of the worker, roughly what it cost to keep him alive and fit, was £3 a day and the worker could embody £3 of value in the product on which he was working in 8 hours, then, if he worked 10 hours, the last 2 hours would yield surplus value, in this case £1. A little further on, Marx expanded on the nature of this surplus value as follows: during the second period of the labor process, that in which his labor is no longer necessary labor, the workman, it is true, labors, expends labor power, but his labor being no longer necessary labor, he creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value which, for the capitalist, has all the charms of a creation out of nothing. This portion of the working day, I name surplus labor time, and to the labor expended during that time, I give the name of surplus labor. It is every bit as important, for a correct understanding of surplus value, to conceive it as a mere congelation of surplus labor time, as nothing but materialized surplus labor, as it is, for a proper comprehension of value, to conceive it as a mere congelation of so many hours of labor, as nothing but materialized labor. The essential difference between the various economic forms of society, between, for instance, a society based on slave labor, and one based on wage labor, lies only in the mode in which the surplus labor is in each case extracted from the actual producer, the laborer. Thus surplus value could only arise from variable capital, not from constant capital, as labor alone created value. Put very simply, Marx's reason for thinking that the rate of profit would decrease was that, with the introduction of machinery, labor time would become less and thus yield less surplus value. Of course, machinery would increase production and colonial markets would absorb some of the surplus, but these were only palliatives and an eventual crisis was inevitable. These first 9 chapters were complemented by a masterly historical account of the genesis of capitalism which illustrates better than any other writing Marx's approach and method. Marx particularly made pioneering use of official statistical information that came to be available from the middle of the 19th century onwards. A reader who finds the beginning of Capital too arid would do well to follow Marx's advice to Mrs. Kubelman and begin by reading the chapters on the working day, machinery and modern industry, and capitalist accumulation. In the chapter on the working day, Marx described in detail the physical and mental degradation forced on men, women and children by working long hours in unhealthy conditions and related the bitter struggle to gain some relief by legal limits on the number of hours worked and the passing of factory acts. Although, Marx concluded, it might seem as though the capitalist and worker exchanged contracts in a free market, the bargain was, in fact, one-sided. The bargain concluded, it is discovered that he was no free agent, that the time for which he is free to sell his labor power is the time for which he is forced to sell it, that in fact the vampire will not loose its hold on him so long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. For protection against the serpent of their agonies, the laborers must put their heads together, and, as a class, compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier that shall prevent the very workers from selling, by voluntary contract with capital, themselves and their families into slavery and death. In place of the pompous catalogue of the inalienable rights of man comes the modest Magna Carta of a legally limited working day, which shall make clear when the time which the worker sells is ended, and when his own begins. Marx continued his indictment of capitalism in the chapter on machinery and modern industry, describing the crippling effect of machinery on workers and the environmental effects of capitalist exploitation of agriculture. Summing up his conclusions, however, Marx showed that his view of technological progress under capitalism was not wholly negative. We have seen how this absolute contradiction between the technical necessities of modern industry and the social character inherent in its capitalistic form dispels all fixity and security in the situation of the laborer, how it constantly threatens, by taking away the instruments of labor, to snatch from his hands his means of subsistence, and, by suppressing his detail function, to make him superfluous. We have seen, too, how this antagonism vents its rage in the creation of that monstrosity, an industrial reserve army, kept in misery in order to be always at the disposal of capital, in the incessant human sacrifices from among the working class, in the most reckless squandering of labor power, and in the devastation caused by a social anarchy which turns every economical progress into a social calamity. This is the negative side. But if, on the one hand, variation of work at present imposes itself after the manner of an overpowering natural law, and with the blindly destructive action of a natural law that meets with resistance at all points, modern industry, on the other hand, through its catastrophes, imposes the necessity of recognizing, as a fundamental law of production, variation of work, consequently fitness of the laborer for varied work, consequently the greatest possible development of his varied aptitudes. It becomes a question of life and death for society to adapt the mode of production to the normal functioning of this law. Modern industry, indeed, compels society, under penalty of death, to replace the detail worker of today, crippled by lifelong repetition of one and the same trivial operation, and thus reduced to the mere fragment of a man, by the fully developed individual, fit for a variety of labors, ready to face any change of production, and to whom the different social functions he performs are but so many modes of giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers. Volume 1 ended with a long section on capitalist accumulation, the finest chapter in the book. The capitalist, being a prey to a Faustian conflict between the passion for accumulation and the desire for enjoyment, was forced to create an industrial reserve army or vast pool of temporarily unemployed workers to serve the fluctuations of the market. Marx synthesized his analyses in the thundering denunciation we saw, when analyzing the production of relative surplus value. Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productiveness of labor are brought about at the cost of the individual laborer. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over, and exploitation of, the producers. They mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work and turn it into a hated toil. They estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor process in the same proportion as science is incorporated in it as an independent power. They distort the conditions under which he works, subject him during the labor process to a despotism the more hateful for its meanness. They transform his lifetime into working time, and drag his wife and child beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of capital. But all methods for the production of surplus value are at the same time methods of accumulation, and every extension of accumulation becomes again a means for the development of those methods. It follows therefore that in proportion as capital accumulates, the lot of the laborer, be his payment high or low, must grow worse. The law, finally, that always equilibrates the relative surplus population, or industrial reserve army, to the extent and energy of accumulation. This law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery, corresponding with accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation, at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. This judgment was supported by a series of detailed studies, moving yet objective, on the condition of the British working classes over the previous 20 years, the British agricultural proletariat, and the misery of Ireland. The book was rounded off with the following famous passage: along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital, who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers, and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with, and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. The subsequent 2 volumes, being only in draft form, have none of the polished verve of Volume 1. There was, however, a long chapter entitled Results of the Immediate Process of Production that Marx seems to have intended to put at the end of Volume 1 but left out at the last minute. In this chapter, Marx discussed how capitalist production reproduced the relationship of capitalist to worker in the total process. There are particularly interesting comments on the alienation involved in the relationship of capitalist to worker and on the tendency of capitalism to reduce as much as possible the number of those working for a wage in the production sphere and increase the number of workers in purely service industries. Whereas Volume 1 had dealt with production, 2 and 3 investigated what happened outside the factory when the capitalist came to sell his products for cash. In Volume 2, Marx traced the circular movement of sale, profit and the plowing back of resources for the next cycle of production and the complex factors underlying economic crises. This volume is far less interesting due to its technical, theoretical nature. The first part of Volume 3 appears to be in a more or less final draft, but thereafter the book tails off without any final conclusion. It begins with a discussion of the conversion of surplus value into profit and thus the relationship between values and prices. Many people on reading Volume 1 had asked how it came about that, if values were measured by socially necessary labor, they should be so very different from market prices. The only answer that Marx provided to this problem was to assert that value was the center of gravity around which prices fluctuate and around which their rise and fall tends to an equilibrium. He continued, no matter what may be the way in which prices are regulated, the result always is the following: the law of value dominates the movement of prices, since a reduction or increase of the labor time required for production causes the prices of production to fall or to rise. Marx then enunciated in more detail than in Volume 1 the falling tendency of the rate of profit, which forms the centerpiece of the third volume. This law is expressed most succinctly by Marx as follows. It is the nature of the capitalist mode of production, and a logical necessity of its development, to give expression to the average rate of surplus value by a felling rate of average profit. Since the mass of the employed living labor is continually on the decline compared to the mass of materialized labor incorporated in productively consumed means of production, it follows that that portion of living labor, which is unpaid and represents surplus value, must also be continually on the decrease compared to the volume and value of the invested total capital. Seeing that the proportion of the mass of surplus value to the value of the invested total capital forms the rate of profit, this rate must fall continuously. Marx then went further into the nature of economic crises, which he traced to the basic contradiction between the necessity of a capitalist economy to expand its production without taking into account the level of consumption that alone could make it feasible. The real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. It is that capital and its self-expansion appear as the starting and the closing point, the motive and the purpose of production, that production is only production for capital and not vice versa. The means of production are not mere means for a constant expansion of the living process of the society of producers. The limits within which the preservation or self-expansion of the value of capital resting on the expropriation and pauperization of the great mass of producers can alone move these limits come continually into conflict with the methods of production employed by capital for its purposes, which drive towards unlimited extension of production as an end in itself, towards unconditional development of the social productivity of labor. The means unconditional development of the productive forces of society comes continually into conflict with the limited purpose, the self-expansion of the existing capital. The conclusion was, the last cause of all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses as compared to the tendency of capitalist production to develop the productive forces in such a way that only the absolute power of consumption of the entire society would be their limit. Marx then dealt with the factors that could slow down the fall in profits, principally increased production and foreign trade, and attempted to show that they can only be short-term palliatives. There followed two sections on interest-bearing capital and ground rent, and the volume ended with the dramatically incomplete section on classes. Even today, Capital, particularly Volume 1, remains a masterpiece. Its historical analyses present an effectively damning picture of at least one aspect of 19th-century England, composed with an attention to detail and a superb style that make it a permanent contribution both to history and to literature. Nor have its theoretical presuppositions or long-term predictions been disproved, if only because they are not susceptible of ultimate refutation. The labor theory of value is not a scientific theory but a theory to be judged by the insights that it gives into the workings of the capitalist system. And Marx's famous predictions are only based on his abstract model of capitalist society, a model capable of almost infinite variation in given circumstances, and, like all models, it must be assessed by its fruitfulness.